Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're going to talk about one of the most consistent terrain features in elk country, saddles. Why elk cross them and how you can use that to your advantage. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more consistent and successful hunter and outdoorsman. If you spend any time studying topographic maps, you've probably noticed saddles. They appear between two high points on a ridge where the elevation dips before climbing again. A lot of hunters recognize those, but very few hunters truly understand how important they really are for elk because saddles quietly control how animals move across mountain terrain. When elk need to cross a ridge, they rarely climb straight over the highest point. Like any animal moving through steep country or human, they naturally drift towards the easiest route. That route is almost always the lowest point along the ridge line, the saddle. Over time, elk are going to begin using those crossings again and again. Trails develop, tracks pile up, and movement funnels through those narrow breaks in the terrain. Once you recognize that pattern, something changes. You stop guessing where elk might cross the ridge. You start predicting where they're most likely to do it. Today, we're going to break down why elk rely on saddles, how to identify the best ones on maps, and how to hunt them effectively on public land. A saddle is simply that low point that we talked about between the two higher areas along a ridge line. Some ridge lines will have multiple saddles. If you imagine those two hills connected by a ridge, the saddle is the dip between them before the terrain climbs again. On a topographic map, though, it usually appears as an hourglass shape in the contour lines. When you stand in one, it often feels like a natural pass through the ridge. Instead of climbing all the way to the highest point, the terrain drops slightly before rising again on the opposite side. That small change in elevation may not look dramatic on the map, but in mountain terrain, it creates a natural crossing point. Saddles form through long-term erosion. Wind, water, snow, movement, and shifting soils gradually wear down parts of the ridgeline faster than the others. Over time, those processes create subtle dips that connect both sides of the mountain. The real reason saddles matter in elk country isn't just the geology, it's how the animals use them. Any place that makes crossing steep terrain easier becomes important for wildlife movement. Instead of climbing the highest part of the ridge, animals, elk, naturally gravitate towards the lowest crossing point. And once animals begin using that crossing consistently, movement concentrates there all the time. Trails form, tracks accumulate, and the saddle becomes one of the most predictable terrain features in the entire mountain ecosystem. Elk live in steep country, we all know that, but they move through it with incredible efficiency, and that's one of the keys. Every day they travel between feeding areas, bedding cover, water, and security terrain. Over time, those repeated movements reinforce routes that require the least amount of climbing, and that's exactly what a saddle provides. Even a small reduction in elevation can make crossing a ridge easier for a large animal like an elk. Instead of climbing the steepest section of the ridge, elk will drift towards that natural dip where crossing requires less effort. Terrain flow also plays a major role here. Mountain landscapes naturally guide movement. Drainages push animals uphill towards ridges, and side hill travel often leads them towards the lowest break in the ridgeline. As elk move through that terrain, those patterns subtly funnel them towards saddles. Exposure is another factor. The very top of the ridge often leaves animals silhouetted against the skyline. Saddles usually sit slightly below that highest point, allowing the elk to cross the ridge with less skyline exposure. Because of those advantages, elk repeatedly use the same crossings year after year, and that repeated use is what makes saddles so valuable for you. Terrain quietly controls how animals move across the mountains. Ridges, drainages, slopes, and terrain breaks all shape the routes elk use while traveling through the landscape, but saddles are one of the clearest examples. As elk move uphill from feeding areas or side hill along a slope, the terrain is going to gradually push them towards the ridgeline. But once they reach that ridge, they still have to choose where to cross. Instead of crossing randomly, they often drift towards the lowest point along the ridge. The surrounding terrain just naturally naturally funnels them there. Multiple travel routes often converge in the same saddle. Elk approaching the ridge from different directions frequently end up crossing through the same terrain break. Over time, those crossings become clearly visible on the landscape. You're going to see trails converge, tracks pile up, and the sign is going to become more concentrated there. And the saddle becomes a predictable place where elk move through the mountains. For hunters, that makes saddles powerful interception points. You're not just guessing where elk might cross, you're positioning yourself where the terrain naturally directs their movement. And because saddles concentrate movement, they often hold some of the heaviest sign you're going to find in elk country. Elk traveling between feeding areas, bedding cover, and water frequently have to cross ridges as part of their travel routes. And when they consistently use the same saddles to make that crossing, their sign is going to begin to build up pretty quickly. Trails form where the animals are going to repeatedly step through that lowest part of the ridge, and those tracks are going to pack into the soil, droppings are going to accumulate along the travel route, and you're going to be able to find them pretty easily. You'll often see multiple trails converging into the same crossing from different directions. During the fall, rubs also show up along those routes. Bulls moving between bedding areas and feeding locations frequently stop along travel corridors to rub the trees, and those rubs often appear along the approaches to saddles. When you find a saddle loaded with all this sign that we're talking about, you're looking at a place elk have been using consistently as part of their movement through the mountain, probably for decades. Hey, if you hunt public land elk and you're tired of grinding through random seasons, I built the elk hunting series of ebooks for you. Most hunters don't struggle because they lack effort. They struggle because they lack a system. And that's exactly why I built the elk hunting ebook series as a complete progressive framework for Western elk hunters who are done guessing and ready to hunt with intention. Volume 1 is going to be Foundations in Reality. I reset your mindset and expose the assumptions that quietly wreck seasons. In Volume 2, Finding Elk and Understanding Pressure, you'll learn how elk actually move under pressure so you can anticipate instead of react. In Volume 3, Terrain, Wind, and Position, I break down how to use landscape and thermals to consistently create opportunities. In Volume 4, Calling, Silence, and Pressure, sound becomes a decision tool, not an impulse. In Volume 5, Bow Hunting Execution, we're talking about close range strategy so you can finish your encounters. And in Volume 6, Late Season and Post Rut, we're talking about how elk shift after the rut and how to adapt when others quit. This is a system built for consistency. This isn't theory, it's a structured system to help you find elk, read country, and make confident decisions every season. Buy each volume individually or bundle them all to save 50% off at backboneunlimited.com. One of the biggest advantages of saddles is that you can identify them long before you ever set foot in the unit. On a topographic map, like we talked about, saddles typically appear as an hourglass shape in the contour lines. Two areas of higher elevation sit on either side with the lines dipping towards them before climbing up again, right? Once you start recognizing that pattern, they become easy to spot across an entire mountain system. But not every saddle is going to be equally valuable. When I'm e-scouting, I focus on saddles that connect meaningful pieces of terrain, like a saddle linking two drainages where elk might feed on one side and bed on the other. Those can become a natural crossing point. Cover is another important factor here. Saddles surrounded by timber or broken terrain tend to provide more security than those sitting wide open. Elk prefer crossing where they can move quickly through cover rather than exposing themselves in that open ridge line. Once you begin marking those saddles during e-scouting, you're essentially just identifying the terrain breaks that control how the animals are going to move through the mountains. Once I identify promising saddles, the next step is figuring out how to hunt them correctly. The first thing I pay attention to is wind. Always comes back to the wind, right? Saddles sit along ridge lines where wind behavior can change quickly. If your scent spills into the crossing, elk are going to know you're there long before you see them. Because of that, I usually approach them from the side where my wind is least likely to drift into the saddle, right? Positioning is the second key factor here. A lot of hunters try to sit directly in the lowest point of that saddle itself if they have cover. But I usually prefer setting up slightly below the crossing on the downwind side where they're less cautious. And that position also allows me to watch elk approach the saddle while still staying concealed and maintaining better wind control. Timing here also matters because saddles tend to see the most movement during transition periods when elk are traveling between feeding and bedding cover. Early morning and evening are usually when elk cross those ridges most frequently. When wind, terrain, positioning, and timing all line up, saddles can become incredibly consistent intercept points for you. One mistake a lot of hunters make is skyline exposure, though. So let's talk about that real quick. Walking directly along a ridgeline might feel more natural to you or easier, but elk approaching the saddle often look uphill as they're nearing those crossings. So if you silhouette yourself against the sky, they're going to detect that movement immediately. Another mistake is watching only the exact low point of the saddle. Elk rarely march straight into the ridge and over the lowest spot. A lot of them approach from the side hill position, right, before crossing those and drifting over the ridge. Pressure can also change how elk use those saddles. In heavily hunted areas, elk might start crossing slightly above or below the saddle if hunters repeatedly move through the same locations. Saddles are a powerful terrain funnel, right? But they only become effective when you approach them with discipline. You've got to manage the wind. You've got to stay off the skyline. You've got to understand how elk are actually going to move through those. Saddles aren't random dips along the ridgeline, right? They're a natural terrain funnel that quietly guides how the elk are moving through the mountain system. When elk need to cross a ridge, they're going to choose that low spot in the most efficient route possible. Over time, that repeated behavior is going to concentrate that movement so that you can track it and find a better ambush spot or a spot to set up for calling. If you're just early in the season, you're wanting to catch elk moving through without trying to overcall. And that's why saddles are going to be a huge key and a reliable source of elk movement. Once you start recognizing those terrain funnels, the mountains are beginning to make more sense for you. Instead of wandering, hoping to find elk, you can begin identifying routes like saddles that they're naturally using to move across the landscape anyway. And that's really the bigger lesson here. Successful elk hunting isn't just about covering random ground. It's about understanding how terrain shapes animal movement. Those are one of the clearest and easy examples I can give you of that principle in real action. Now, if you want to go deeper into elk movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the elk hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how elk actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. If you want hands-on application and real-time breakdowns, we've built an in-person Elk Camp 2026 that is built around this same philosophy: structure, preparation, and execution in real terrain, real scenarios. You can check out the Elk Camp 2026 at backboneunlimited.com. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital content of elk resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.